can't tell you how much I sympathize with the way everybody has had to endure this unbelievably testing and challenging time.
The world thought it already knew the story. A prince, a princess, a marriage watched by millions, and a love that seemed to fall apart under the weight of crowns, cameras, and expectations no human being could ever fully carry. For decades, the narrative around King Charles III and Princess Diana has been told, retold, analyzed, and dissected from every possible angle. A fairy tale that turned into a cautionary tale, a romance that became a rupture. But what if the version the world accepted wasn't the full truth? What if behind the headlines, behind the scandals, behind the carefully constructed public image, there was something else? Something quieter, something unfinished, and something that never had the chance to be spoken until now. Because on a quiet morning inside Buckingham Palace, something happened that would shake even the strongest walls of royal composure. It wasn't a press conference. It wasn't a political crisis. It wasn't even a public event. It was something far more personal, a moment that no cameras captured, a moment that history was never supposed to see. March 15th, 2024. The palace was unusually still. Inside a private study once used by Queen Elizabeth II, King Charles sat alone. The room carried the weight of decades, portraits staring down from the walls, polished with surfaces reflecting soft morning light, and a quiet echo of decisions that shaped a nation. But this morning felt different, heavier, more personal. A tray of correspondence had just been delivered, official documents, invitations, letters from institutions and dignitaries across the world. Routine, expected, until it wasn't, because among those envelopes there was something that didn't belong. A small parcel, wrapped in faded blue paper, unremarkable at first glance. But the moment Charles saw the handwriting on the label, everything changed. Time didn't just slow. It stopped, because that handwriting was unmistakable. It belonged to Diana. For a brief second, it didn't make sense. It couldn't make sense. And yet, there it was. Real, physical, impossible. The room seemed to shrink around him. When Sir Clive Alderton quietly asked if the parcel should be set aside, Charles didn't respond immediately. Because in that moment, he wasn't a king. He wasn't a public figure. He was a man staring at a ghost from his past. "Leave me," he finally said. The door closed, and silence took over. What happened next would never be recorded in official archives, but it would change everything. His hands, steady through decades of public duty, began to tremble. Carefully, slowly, he turned the parcel over. Every movement carried hesitation. Because opening it meant something. It meant confronting something long buried, something unresolved. The paper peeled away with a faint sound that echoed louder than it should have in the stillness of the room. Inside, a small mahogany box, elegant, personal, marked with the Spencer family crest, a detail that made his breath catch. Because this wasn't random. This was intentional, deliberate. Inside the lid, an envelope, cream-colored, delicate, dated August 29th, 1997, 2 days before the world lost Diana. That date alone was enough to send a chill through him. But it was the first line of the letter that truly broke whatever composure remained. "My dearest Charles." Not "Your Majesty." Not formal. Not distant. Charles. Just Charles. As if time had rewound to a place before titles, before expectations, before everything fell apart. As he read, the room seemed to disappear. The years between then and now collapsed into nothing, because the voice in that letter wasn't the one the world remembered. It wasn't the media's Diana. It wasn't the icon. It was something far more human, far more intimate. A woman reflecting not on scandal, but on love, on regret, on what could have been. And then, the words that changed everything. "This box holds the truth I could never say while I lived." That was the moment the air shifted. Because whatever was inside that box wasn't just a memory. It was a revelation. Something hidden. Something protected. Something that had waited nearly 3 decades to be found. When Charles lifted the lid, a faint fragrance escaped into the room. Jasmine and roses. Her scent. It didn't just trigger memory. It transported him. Back to a time before the fractures. Before the distance. before the silence between them became louder than anything they ever said. And beneath the silk lining, another note, short, hurried, dated just hours before a final trip. What it revealed was something no one, not the public, not the palace, not even Charles himself, had ever known. A truth buried in time, a truth that redefined everything. Because according to the words written in that moment, there had been another child, a daughter, a life that existed only briefly and was never spoken of again. The emotional weight of that realization is impossible to measure, not just because of what was lost, but because of what was never known, never shared, never grieved together. And suddenly, moments from the past began to rearrange themselves. Memories that once felt distant, now felt different. Silences that once seemed ordinary, now felt heavy with meaning. What if the distance between them wasn't just emotional? What if it was built on things left unsaid, things never revealed? And as Charles continued reading, another layer unfolded. Pages from a private diary, words written not for the world, but for herself, unfiltered, unpolished, honest. And in those words, a version of Diana that few had ever seen. Not the global icon, not the symbol, but a woman reflecting on her own choices, her own regrets, her own love, because in those final entries, there was no anger, no blame, just clarity, and something even more unexpected. Hope that somehow, against everything, there might still have been a way back, a way to rebuild something broken, a way to return, not as royalty, but as two people who once loved each other before the world complicated everything. And then came the moment that reframed history itself. Her reflection on her final relationship. What the world saw wasn't what she felt. What the headlines reported wasn't what she believed. Because behind it all, there was still one truth she couldn't escape. She had never truly moved on. And perhaps neither had he. That realization doesn't just change how you see their story. It changes how you understand it. Because it suggests something far more complex than failure. It suggests timing, fear, pride, and the devastating consequences of words left unspoken. And then, the final entry, the one written just a day before everything ended. A moment suspended in time. A decision almost made. A phone call almost placed. Two people in two different places, thinking the same thing, feeling the same hesitation, waiting for the other to act. And in that space between intention and action, history took a different path, because sometimes the most important words are the ones never said. And what remained after reading everything wasn't just grief, it was realization. A realization that the story the world believed was only part of the truth. Because beneath the titles, beneath the expectations, beneath the relentless spotlight, there had been something real, something fragile, something unfinished. As night fell over Buckingham Palace, the room returned to silence, but it wasn't the same silence, because now it carried something else. Understanding, regret, and a question that can never truly be answered. What if things had been different? What if that call had been made? What if fear hadn't won? What if love had been given one more chance? Charles sat there, surrounded not by history, but by possibility, by a version of life that almost happened. And as he finally whispered words decades too late, they echoed not just through the room, but through everything that could have been. I would have said yes. And in that moment, it wasn't about monarchy. It wasn't about legacy. It wasn't about public image. It was about something far simpler. Two people, a love that never fully disappeared, and a story that, even now, refuses to end. But even after everything he had read, the box wasn't finished with him yet. Because sometimes the past doesn't return all at once. Sometimes it reveals itself in fragments, carefully, almost deliberately, as if it knows the human heart can only take so much truth at one time. Charles sat motionless, the weight of the letters pressing down on him, not physically, but emotionally, like something far heavier than paper. For decades, he had learned how to control expression, how to remain composed under scrutiny, how to carry the burden of expectation without letting it show. But this was different, because this wasn't about the crown. This wasn't about duty. This was about memory. And memory doesn't follow rules. It doesn't respect time. It doesn't wait for permission. It arrives when it wants, and it stays as long as it needs. His eyes drifted back to the box. There was still something inside. Something he hadn't touched yet. A final envelope, different from the others, marked in a way that felt urgent, deliberate, almost as if Diana herself had known this would be the hardest part. Read this last. 3 simple words. But they carried weight. The kind of weight that makes you hesitate before opening something. Because deep down, you already know it might change everything. For a moment, Charles didn't move. His fingers rested lightly on the edge of the envelope. And in that pause, something shifted inside him. Not fear, not exactly, but recognition. Because whatever was inside, it wasn't just about the past anymore. It was about understanding it. Finally, completely, he opened it. Slowly, carefully. The paper inside was slightly different. Thinner, more fragile, as if it had been handled more than once. And the handwriting, it wasn't rushed like the earlier notes. It was steady, intentional, every word placed exactly where it needed to be, as if Diana knew this would be the last thing he read. The final truth, the final piece, the final voice. Charles, not my dearest, not your, just his name. Simple, direct, honest. If you've made it this far, then you've seen the parts of me the world never did. He swallowed, because that was already true. Everything he had read so far had felt like stepping into a version of her that had never been shared publicly. Not polished, not protected, just real. And then the letter continued. There's one thing I need you to understand. Not as a king, not as a father of our children, but as a man I once loved. The words didn't accuse. They didn't blame. They didn't reopen wounds. They did something far more powerful. They clarified. None of it was ever as simple as they made it seem. And in that moment, decades of headlines seemed to echo in his mind. Stories, narratives, assumptions, all of them built piece by piece over years. And yet here, in her own words, was something entirely different. I made mistakes. You made mistakes. But what we had was never fake. Charles closed his eyes briefly, because that line alone carried more truth than years of public interpretation. What they had wasn't perfect, but it was real. And sometimes, real love doesn't survive not because it wasn't strong enough, but because the world around it was too loud, too demanding, too unforgiving. The letter continued. I think, in another life, one without titles, without expectations, we might have found our way back to each other much sooner. That sentence didn't just linger. It settled, deep, because it wasn't just about regret. It was about possibility, a life that existed only in imagination, a version of them that the world never allowed to exist. And then, the words that made his grip tighten slightly on the page. I don't want you to carry guilt for what we lost. That was unexpected, because if anything, guilt had been the quiet companion of memory for years. Not spoken, not acknowledged, but always there. And yet, here she was, removing it, or at least trying to, carry the truth instead. Truth, such a simple word. But in this moment, it felt heavier than anything else. Because truth doesn't just inform, it transforms. And the truth, as he was now beginning to understand it, was far more complex than anything the world had ever been told. You loved me in the only way you knew how. That line broke something. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, like a realization that arrives too late, but still matters. Because love doesn't always look the way it's expected to. It doesn't always meet the standard. It doesn't always survive the pressure. But that doesn't mean it wasn't there. And maybe that had been the misunderstanding all along. Not the absence of love, but the inability to express it in a way that could withstand everything around it. And I loved you, even when I didn't know how to show it without hurting us both. The honesty in that sentence was disarming. No defenses, no image, no narrative, just truth. Two people, trying, failing, trying again, and somewhere along the way, losing their way. Not because they didn't care, but because they didn't know how to navigate something that had never been meant to be lived in public. The letter was nearing its end. Charles could feel it. There was a shift in the tone, a quiet closing, not abrupt, not rushed, but final. If there's one thing I wish we had done differently. He paused, because this was it, the last reflection, the final thought, the one thing that might have changed everything. The room felt still again, as if even time was waiting. We should have spoken honestly, sooner. No drama, no grand revelation, just that, and somehow that simplicity made it more powerful than anything else. Because in the end, it wasn't one event, it wasn't one mistake, it wasn't one decision. It was silence, silence that stretched over years, silence that allowed misunderstanding to grow, silence that replaced truth with assumption, and silence that came at a cost neither of them fully understood until it was too late. The final lines were softer, almost like a whisper across time. Take care of them, the way we both always wanted to. A reference, unmistakably, to Prince William and Prince Harry, their sons, the one part of their story that had always remained strong, even when everything else struggled. Tell them, I never stopped believing in us. That line lingered longer than the rest, because belief is different from certainty. It's quieter, more fragile, but sometimes more enduring. And then, the final sentence. Goodbye didn't appear. There was no dramatic ending, no final declaration, just something simple. Something deeply human. Thank you for the love we did have. Charles lowered the letter slowly, not because he wanted to, but because there was nothing left to read. And yet, everything had changed. The room was the same. The walls hadn't moved. The portrait still watched in silence. But inside that space, something had shifted permanently, because the story he had carried for decades was no longer the same story. It hadn't been rewritten, but it had been completed, and completion doesn't always bring closure. Sometimes it brings clarity, and clarity can be just as overwhelming. He looked once more at the contents of the box, the letters, the locket, the fragments of a life shared and a life imagined, and for the first time in a long time, there was no anger, no defensiveness, no distance, just understanding, the kind that arrives slowly, but stays forever. Outside, the world continued as it always had. People moved, headlines formed, stories were written. But inside that room, none of that mattered, because this wasn't about the world anymore. It was about something much quieter, much more personal, a realization that love, even when it doesn't last the way we expect, doesn't disappear. It changes, it evolves, it stays in the spaces between memory and truth, and sometimes it waits. Not to return, but to be understood. As the evening shadows stretched across the floor, Charles remained seated, not as a king, not as a figure of history, but as a man who had finally seen the full picture of a story the world thought it already knew. And in that silence, there was one thought that refused to fade. Not regret, not exactly, but something close. A quiet acknowledgement of timing, of choices, of moments that passed without knowing their weight. Because in the end, it wasn't just about what happened. It was about what almost happened. And sometimes, that's the part that stays with us the longest. And when the last word had been read, the room didn't feel empty. It felt full, full of everything that had never been said, full of moments that almost happened, full of a love that never truly found its ending, only its silence. Charles sat there, unmoving, the letter resting gently in his hands, not as a king, not as a symbol, but as a man who had just discovered that the past he thought he understood was only half the truth. Because sometimes the greatest tragedies aren't built on hatred. They are built on hesitation, on pride, on words that stay locked inside until time runs out. And in that quiet room, surrounded by history, duty, and memory, one truth became impossible to ignore. They hadn't stopped loving each other. They had simply stopped reaching for each other. Outside the palace walls, the world continued exactly as it always had. People moved forward. Headlines changed. Time refused to pause. But inside that moment, time felt different, slower, heavier, almost as if it was giving him one final chance to feel everything he never allowed himself to feel before. His eyes drifted once more to the letter, to the final words he had written. Simple, honest, unprotected. Thank you for the love we did have. And for the first time in decades, he didn't look away from the past. He faced it completely. No titles, no expectations, no distance left to hide behind. Just truth. And maybe that's what this story was always meant to be. Not a fairy tale, not a scandal, not a tragedy defined by headlines, but something far more human. A story about timing, about fear, about two people who loved deeply but couldn't find their way at the moment it mattered most. Because in the end, love doesn't always fail because it disappears. Sometimes it fails because it arrives at the wrong time. And sometimes it stays, quietly, waiting to be understood. Long after the world has moved on, Charles slowly placed the letter back into the box. Not to forget it, but to preserve it. Because some truths aren't meant to be hidden anymore. They are meant to be remembered differently. As the light faded across the room, one thought remained. Not spoken loudly, not declared, just felt, deeply. If things had been different, if one call had been made, if one moment had been braver than the rest, everything might have changed. But history doesn't rewrite itself. It only leaves behind echoes. And sometimes, those echoes are enough to remind us that even in silence, love never truly disappears. It simply waits to be understood.